Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Betty Chang, and I'm the area lead in research at EUFIC, specializing in consumer science. So just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded. You will receive the slides, and any questions for me can go in the Q&A. You can also upvote questions in the Q&A, and I will try to answer those that have the most upvotes first. If there are any questions I can't answer during this session, you will receive the written answer with the slides and the recording at the end of the webinar. Before I discuss the research we conducted on food and health literacy, I want to share with you a couple of slides about our organization, the European Food Information Council, or EUFIC, in order to better explain the purpose behind this research. So EUFIC is a non-profit organization that has been around in Brussels for almost 30 years. We support consumers in adopting healthier and more sustainable diets through our communication and activities that are founded on science-based information. This can include creating content, developing and implementing communication campaigns, and conducting consumer research, of which our food literacy survey is an example. We also collaborate with other organizations and are involved in EU projects for some of these activities. So here are the main topics we work on. The first is food and health science literacy, of which this survey falls under. This is to help promote evidence-based decision-making, not only in consumers, so they know the effects of different ways of eating on their health, but also for various stakeholders who can apply our research to improve their activities. Another key area for us is to facilitate the healthy and sustainable dietary shift, which involves reducing excess meat consumption and eating a more plant-forward diet. We also work on supporting and preventing diet and lifestyle-related non-communicable diseases, such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes type 2. And last but not least, we aim to empower consumers to reduce their household food waste as part of a more sustainable dietary practice. So you might see some of these themes in my presentation. In the context of our first long-term goal of building food and health science literacy, we conducted this survey to find out what consumers understand in this area and where their greatest knowledge gaps are, in order to better tailor our activities to address these gaps. The survey was conducted in the main countries corresponding to the languages that EUFIC publishes its online materials that's Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and the UK. We also included Slovenia and Turkey because a couple of our members were interested in collecting data in these countries. So they were our collaborators NUTRIS, the National Nutrition Institute in Slovenia, and Sabri Ülker Research Foundation in Turkey, or Turkey, who funded samples there. The samples were nationally representative for age and gender in the adult population. We also examined whether consumer segments that have been shown to eat less healthily might have greater deficiencies in food literacy. So one group is males who are more likely to overeat and less likely to meet recommendations for fruit and vegetable intake. Another group that is less interested in healthy eating are young adults who have less healthy diets than other age groups. Part of this could be due to the fact that they are at a life stage where they have to prepare food more for themselves, but they lack the information needed to do this. Research has also found that those with a lower level of education also tend to eat less healthily and have a higher body mass index. In our study, we classified those with less education as participants who had been educated up to high school level, that is secondary education, and those with more education we classified as those who had pursued education after high school. So here, I will describe the main findings, just to let you know that the first part of our survey tested people's nutrition knowledge that consisted of around 40 true and false questions. So most of these questions were from the Consumer Nutrition Knowledge Scale from Dixon Spillman et al. 2011. But since this scale is not the most recent one, we also supplemented the questions with some more up-to-date questions about other important nutrition issues. And so here I'm going to present some of the more high-impact myths and related findings. That is, the myths that more participants got wrong and that also might have the potential to cause more harm. So the first one is that 80.7% of respondents across the countries felt that a healthy meal should consist of half protein, a quarter vegetables, and a quarter carbohydrates. So this is in contrast to widespread dietary recommendations that generally propose that people should eat half vegetables, a quarter protein, and a quarter carbohydrates. So this means that people are overestimating their protein requirements and underestimating the fruit and vegetable recommendations. So this is shown in the graph on the left. On the right, we have a related question that we asked participants, how easy or difficult it was for them to compose a balanced meal, to which the average score rating was around 3.4, with 3 being neither difficult nor easy. So for both questions, we find that younger adults, males, and those with less education score worse in both cases. And they were more likely to answer incorrectly what a healthy meal should consist of, and they indicated more difficulty with composing a balanced meal. The fact that over 80% of respondents scored this question incorrectly was quite surprising to us, particularly as many national dietary guidelines indicate that a healthy meal should consist of around half fruits and vegetables and about a quarter protein and a quarter carbohydrates. So here are the figures of the dietary guidelines of the countries in the survey, except for that of France, which I couldn't find a graphical representation of. So you can see that there is still a lot of work to do in educating people about what a healthy, balanced meal looks like, and that the presence of national dietary guidelines alone is not enough. So my team even wondered whether the high inaccuracy rate could be due to response fatigue in the survey. But since this particular question was the first one people answered after filling in their demographic info, these responses are unlikely due to response fatigue. So relatedly, most people reported little familiarity with national dietary guidelines, scoring about 2.5 on average, on a scale where 2 indicates being a little familiar and 3 indicates being somewhat familiar. So those that were less familiar tended to be older, male, and those with less education. Respondents tended to be somewhat familiar with national recommendations about fruit and vegetable consumption, as we see on the top right, and a little less familiar with national recommendations about salt intake, shown on the bottom right. Again, males and those with less education reported less familiarity with these recommendations. Another popular myth is that carbohydrates cause weight gain, with almost 75% of people believing this, and males more likely to do so. So one manifestation of this belief is the keto diet, which advises restricting carb intake to 5 to 10% and increasing fat intake to 70 to 80%, which is very much against national dietary guidelines. However, there is no consistent evidence to support that myth that carbs themselves cause weight gain. In a 2022 review of the research, it was found that there was no difference in weight loss when people who were overweight and obese ate either a low carbohydrate or balanced carbohydrate weight weight reducing diets. Another 2022 systematic review looked at the effectiveness of a low fat, high carbohydrate diet as compared to a low carbohydrate, high fat diet like the keto diet on weight loss and cardiovascular risk factors. So the authors of this study concluded that both diets effectively helped control weight and reduced cardiovascular risk factors. So at EUFIC, we are currently writing an article about the relationship between carbohydrates and weight in order to address this particular myth. Another misconception about carbohydrates is that almost 70% of people think that brown sugar is healthier than white sugar. For all intents and purposes, brown and white sugar have comparable nutritional profiles. Although brown sugar has slightly higher calcium, iron, and potassium contents, these amounts of these minerals in brown sugar are insignificant, so it is not a good source of any vitamins or minerals. Brown sugar also contains slightly fewer calories than white sugar, but the difference is minimal. So 1 teaspoon of brown sugar contains 15 calories, while the same amount of white sugar has 16.3 calories. Now, whether this myth is problematic or not depends on how people act upon this belief. For example, does it make them consume more brown sugar thinking than they would white sugar, thinking that it's healthier? It's also interesting to see that there are some country variations to this myth, with those in France and Turkey, for example, believing this myth to a greater extent. On a related issue, we also developed a question to examine people's understanding of the role of refined carbohydrates in contributing to type 2 diabetes, as this condition is one of the leading causes of nutrition-related death. So the question that we came up with was, refined carbohydrates such as table sugar, added sugar in foods, white bread, white pasta, and white rice all lead to a relatively high increase in blood glucose and insulin. Experiencing high levels of blood sugar and insulin for long periods of time can lead to insulin resistance and impaired insulin secretion. So many people understood that this increases the chance of developing type 2 diabetes and can cause irreversible damage to eyes, nerves, kidneys, and blood vessels. So it was quite reassuring to know that people understood this. On a different topic, 75% of respondents think that fresh produce is healthier than frozen produce, although these are both nutritionally similar. This myth was subject to a lot of country variation, and this variation may be related to the fact that some national dietary guidelines on this issue differ in a manner that is consistent with cultural differences in people's beliefs. For example, people were less likely to think that fresh produce is nutritionally superior to frozen in France and the UK, and these countries also explicitly mention frozen produce as being included in their fruit and vegetable recommendations. On the other hand, those in Italy and Slovenia were relatively more likely to think that fresh is best, and their national dietary guidelines also advise them to consume vegetables and fruits that are fresh. One might think that because fresh produce is not nutritionally worse than frozen, it's not necessarily a problem for people to hold this belief. But frozen produce does have other benefits over fresh that makes it easier for people to consume more fruits and vegetables, such as being cheaper, saving people time, and helping them to reduce food waste. So it could be that communicating to people about the nutritional value of frozen produce may help them to more easily meet recommended consumption levels. There was also a lot of country variation in whether 100% fruit juice counts as one portion of fruit, with 53% of people answering this question incorrectly across the countries. Again, country variations are somewhat consistent with differences in national dietary guidelines. The countries that are more likely to disagree with the statement, such as Italy and Spain, also have guidelines that do not support the idea that fruit juice counts as one portion of fruit. And the guidelines from Turkey recommend the consumption of whole fruit and vegetables instead of juice. So this might be understandable given that these countries traditionally had a relatively high child obesity rate. And so perhaps these dietary guidelines were adapted to discourage excess sugar intake in children. In terms of the processing of meat, most people understood that processed meat was not good for their health, with almost 40% realizing that the increased risk that consuming processed meat increase the risk of stomach and bowel cancer, and that they are high in salt and saturated fat. On another issue of processed food, 54% of people believe that all food additives, those that have E numbers, are bad for you, although such ingredients are certified as safe by the European Food Safety Authority. So you might think, oh, if only we informed people that E-numbered ingredients are regulated to be safe, then we could disabuse people of the notion that all food additives are harmful to health. However, according to recent consumer research, small consumers, they're not, think that ultra-processed foods are not sufficiently regulated by authorities. So this came from a report by the EIT Food Consumer Observatory, which suggests that people won't necessarily trust something that is safe just because it's regulated. At EUFIC, we have also noticed that this perception that food additives are unsafe tends to be persistent, and it could relate to the natural equals good versus artificial equals bad intuition that people tend to have. In contrast to other myths, this time women were more likely to erroneously believe this, as well as those with less education. Another popular myth is that eggs increase blood cholesterol levels, with 51% of people believing this to be the case, and males more likely to get this wrong. Now, this is a tricky one because the history about recommended egg intake is like a roller coaster. About 50 years ago, people first concluded that because eggs are full of cholesterol, even eating one can increase the risk of a heart attack. Then the consensus was that eggs contain both good and bad cholesterol, and that we should just eat the egg whites and not the egg yolks. And now we know that the amount of cholesterol in food does not affect blood cholesterol levels because blood cholesterol levels are actually affected by cholesterol made by the liver, a process that is derived from saturated fat intake. So you can understand why people are about 50-50 split on this issue. You can also see different national dietary guidelines tackling egg recommendations in very different ways, with some allowing up to 4 eggs a day, some recommending for a week, some not making any egg-specific recommendations, and some just saying to eat eggs in moderation without defining what moderation means in this case. So it's a pity that so many people still think that eggs can be a problem because they are relatively affordable, nutrient dense, and filling. So people may be avoiding them unnecessarily, although eggs could really fill multiple dietary needs. Another myth where there is a lot of country variation is that 49% of people don't realize that it's recommended to eat 2 to 3 portions of dairy per day. And those with less education are 27% more likely to get this wrong. Now, other countries in this study make this dairy recommendation. So the country differences we see are not due to major differences in national recommendations, although there is some variation in the wording of the recommendation that may influence how easy it is to understand. The fact that only about half of consumers know about this dairy recommendation is a particular problem because insufficient calcium intake can result in osteoporosis, which puts people at risk of persistent fragility fractures. And in Europe, fragility fractures are the 4th leading cause of chronic diseases, behind coronary heart disease, dementia, and lung cancer. So not only are such fractures painful, but they often lead to serious psychological disorders such as depression, anxiety, and fear, and that can cost huge economic pressure to society. There were also other misconceptions about dairy that people had, with 46.3% not realizing that dairy products contain more saturated fats than vegetable oils, and 45.9% thinking erroneously that skimmed milk has less minerals than full-fat milk. One of the more popular and problematic myths is that drinking red wine in moderation is good for the health. with 77.5% of people believing this to be true. You may notice that this question was removed from the Turkish version of the survey because it is a predominantly Islamic country. The reason why people might think red wine is healthy is because past research overestimated the benefits of moderate drinking, and people who reported the results were not very careful about it. So you see that science journalists can carry a lot of influence, and with that, responsibility. By contrast, current research indicates that even low levels of drinking have added risks, which is why the World Health Organization put out a statement last year that alcohol is a carcinogen and that no level of alcohol is safe. And some national guidelines, such as those in Germany and Spain, have also recommended against alcohol. Indeed, the World Health Organization noted that although it is well established that alcohol can cause cancer, the fact is still not widely known to the public in most countries, which our results would seem to support. So because of this, EUFIC is also currently writing an article to dispel the myth that red wine in moderation is good for the health. By contrast, people did tend to realize that a wide variety of foods, including salt, alcohol, saturated fat, caffeine, and sugar, increased their blood pressure, although this seemed to be less strongly associated with sugar. Now, the reason why this scale goes past 100% is that respondents were able to choose more than one response. So, in all countries, respondents thought that diet had a stronger effect on obesity compared to other outcomes, such as heart disease, good health, and cancer, with one exception. So in Spain, obesity and good health were similarly associated with diet. In general, those who were older, female, and more educated tended to feel that diet had a stronger effect on these outcomes. So now I will present how people understand everyday scientific concepts that may influence how they interpret nutrition findings reported in the media. So this part of the survey was based on 6 questions from the Everyday Science Reasoning Scale by Golumbik et al., complemented by extra questions we developed about other scientific concepts. So our survey included 2 questions that examined people's understanding of correlational research. The one on the left is from the Everyday Science Reasoning Scale of Golumbik et al. 2022, and the one on the right is the one that we developed. As you can see in both cases, even though the research presented is correlational in nature in the questions, about 60 to 65% of respondents across the countries draw conclusions about causal relationships. So this suggests that people may not sufficiently discriminate between the reliability of epidemiological research, which is correlational, versus experimental research, which examines causal relationships. As such, science reporters would do well to point out in their communication when a study is correlational in nature, explicitly mentioning that the results are not conclusive and could be due to confounding variables. Another scientific principle respondents had trouble with was scientific consensus, not realizing that it's difficult to draw conclusions when expert views differ. So this question in our survey describes how the World Health Organization suggests that a certain diet is safe and effective, but that 2 other scientists consider the same diet may have dangerous health implications. Across the countries, around 60% of people concluded that this meant that the diet was dangerous, suggesting that people may have a negativity bias when interpreting results. There was also quite a lot of country variation. Those in the UK were more likely to think that this conclusion could not be drawn, whereas around 75% of people in Turkey thought that it could be. This suggests that people are apt to jump to conclusions based on mixed findings, and thus may overweight the implications of individual studies against meta-analysis and reviews, for example, even though meta-analysis and reviews are more reliable than individual studies. So it's up to science communicators when reporting findings to point out whether new findings are coherent with previous literature or whether they need replicating by other research. We also designed a question in our survey to test whether people understand dose-response sensitivity and whether they would tend to generalize from results with non-human subjects to humans. So in this question, uh, it stated a study has shown that high concentrations of paraffin, an artificial flavor that we made up, can cause tumors in rats. From this, we can conclude that paraffin shouldn't be allowed in food, that paraffin increases the risk of cancer in humans, artificial flavors are bad for us, or none of the above, of which the last one, none of the above, is correct. So we found that people tended not to understand dose response sensitivity, thinking that something that is harmful to rats in high concentrations is necessarily harmful at any concentration. And they tended to think that results from rats can generalize to humans as well, with less than 15% of people on average realizing that we cannot use the results of this study to draw conclusions about the effect of this substance on humans. This suggests that people, that actors reporting such results to the public should also be made aware of dose response sensitivity and generalizability and report these issues in order not to lead their audience astray. So for this last finding, we designed this last question based on the World Health Organization's controversial recommendation against non-sugar sweeteners last year, as we were curious to know how the lay public would interpret it. So we took the exact wording of the recommendation, as you can see here, and we asked people to interpret what it meant. So the question is, the World Health Organization recommends against people taking non-sugar sweeteners to control body weight or reduce the risk of non-communicable diseases, for example, type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. From this, we can conclude non-sugar sweeteners are unsafe. People with diabetes should not use non-sugar sweeteners. Non-sugar sweeteners cannot help people to lose weight. Sugar is healthier than non-sugar sweeteners, or the correct answer, which is none of the above. Across the countries, with the notable exception of the UK, people were more likely to interpret this as meaning that non-sugar sweeteners are unsafe, and they were relatively less likely to choose the correct response. Now, we see an opposite pattern in the UK, with relatively more people realizing that none of the above conclusions are applicable. So this could be at least partly due to the fact that in the UK, there is an organization called the Science Media Centre that tries to educate journalists on how to accurately report scientific findings. They do this by sending out quotes from experts and statistical analyses of scientific studies, in addition to running regular press briefings on the latest hot topics. As you can see here, one of the experts the Science Media Center had commenting on the World Health Organization recommendation was later quoted in a popular newspaper, The Guardian, with the original quote saying, "The role of non-sugar sweeteners as a way to reduce calories in the short term is, however, supported by evidence. So using sweeteners can be part of interventions to manage weight in the short term." So when people in the UK are reading statements like this, it's probably a lot easier for them to bypass the red herring responses and choose the correct response to the WHO recommendation. So that's it for the main findings. Now I will discuss their implications. In terms of food literacy, we see that consumers have trouble understanding the composition of a healthy meal and balanced diet, tending to overestimate the recommended proportion of protein and or underestimate the recommended proportion of fruits and vegetables. And so improving this understanding may help people to eat more healthily. National dietary guidelines across the countries are quite consistent about the proportions of foods that different types of foods that should be consumed. And so it may be that either these guidelines are not widely disseminated enough or they are not easy for people to understand and remember. We see that many respondents also felt that carbohydrates contributed to weight gain, despite research indicating that carbohydrate levels alone are not the critical factor in weight gain. We also see that people's knowledge about the effects of red wine and eggs should be updated, and we see that potentially having more guidance about the nutritional value of frozen produce could make it easier for people to eat more fruits and vegetables. Another food group for which people could be better educated about is dairy recommendations, given the prevalence of osteoporosis and fragility fractures in later age, and how earlier intake of dairy can protect against this. So the question then becomes, how should we best educate consumers about these issues? Because clearly just having national dietary guidelines alone is not enough. So perhaps more research is needed on more effective communication of the guidelines, or the actors who are in greater contact with the general public about nutrition issues can play a bigger role in disseminating such information, such as general practitioners, community centers, and chefs. People's expectations of what a healthy meal should look like might also be influenced by social norms, such as the types of meals that are served outside in canteens and restaurants and that are presented in ready meals, and meals that they see in images from the media. So if there was a greater representation of balanced meals in these settings, that could potentially also influence how people feel they should eat. People may also benefit from having tools to plan balanced diets. This could be as simple as recipes that follow recommended nutritional guidelines that consumers know will provide a balanced meal. Or it could be something like meal planning or grocery shopping apps that help people keep track of the portions of different food groups in their weekly shop. In terms of food science literacy, we see that consumers have difficulty with correlation versus causation, which makes it hard for them to evaluate epidemiological versus experimental data. They also have a tendency to readily draw conclusions, and they do this in the face of conflicting scientific views, and they make inferences from studies with rats to humans without taking into account that dosages can be critical to the outcome. But there is an argument to be made that from an evolutionary point of view, these information biases can be adaptive in some cases. So it can also be hard to influence people not to think in this way. There's also an argument to be made that from an applied communication point of view, that people implicitly trust that the information reported to them is information that they are supposed to know and that has been vetted by a domain expert and is fit for public consumption. They don't expect that they have to look into the details of the research to know how it fits in with the wider body of research in order to know whether they can trust the reported conclusions. And most people are not in a position to do so. So one way of addressing this problem is to increase the accuracy of how food research is reported. So we previously saw an example of how the Science Media Center does this. This could be done by educating the gatekeepers of science information, such as university press release officers and other science communicators, about what they should pay attention to when interpreting a study and how to contextualize the implications of research to the audience. At EUFIC, we are doing something similar by running communication workshops where different actors in the food system come together to agree on how they should talk about certain food topics. When we notice that there is a food topic that has recently been published about in the media and is causing a lot of confusion, we also put out articles under the heading of food fact articles to try and clarify the meaning behind the research and results. And we also know that another organization in Spain, Maldita, also does something similar. So there is a link at the bottom of this slide showing the food fact articles EUFIC has published. Of course, where opportunities exist, it could also help to educate consumers about science, digital, and media literacy to empower them to find more reliable information. We also saw from the consumer segments that tended to eat less healthily, they also tend to have worse nutrition knowledge. That is, younger adults, males, and those who are less educated. When we look at the gaps in the literature, we realize there is a lot of work to be done in how to communicate to these particular segments about food in a way that is engaging and relevant for them. It can be more of a challenge because some of these segments, particularly younger adults and males, tend to be less interested in healthy eating. It could help to reach these segments through channels that are more targeted towards them, such as schools, universities, youth clubs, sports clubs, and gyms, where healthy eating can also complement their fitness or performance goals. For those with a low level of education, a review has shown that nutritional education interventions via food banks can be effective in improving their knowledge skills related to food and cooking and fresh produce intake in people of a lower socioeconomic status. At the moment, we at EUFIC are also examining how to improve communication about healthy eating towards these consumer segments. So if you could be interested in supporting or collaborating with us in these activities, just let us know. Thank you very much. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Betty. I'll give you a few seconds to open the Q&A tab, but there was a lot of questions. I've tried to answer some myself. What I suggest for the time you have is that you maybe prioritize them based on the number of votes that they received. And I would say the first question comes from Pablo Garcia Campos.
Okay, so Pablo asks, regarding what a healthy meal is, there is a lot of new literature on how food pyramids are not a great representation of healthy meals. Yeah, and we see one example of this in the Slovenian national dietary guidelines. What is my view of this? Well, I don't know about food pyramids in particular, but when I look at the results of our survey, I can see that there is a lot of improvement to be made. So I guess this finding supports the finding that Pablo mentions supports our research as well. And Christina, oh, sorry, that's number 6 votes. Number 5 from Georgios Marakis. Did you do a sample size calculation to deter? Okay, the question's just shifted. Sample size calculation. Okay. Power calculation to determine the number of participants in each country. How many participated in each country? Okay, so the number of participants in each country, except for Turkey, were 500 per country, and Turkey had 1,000 because Turkey has a much larger population, so they needed more people to be tested to be more representative. If you're looking in general at survey, if you want to get a nationally representative sample on age and gender, normally 400 participants is recommended. So but if it really also depends on how large the country is. In this case, we went with 500 participants with each country. Next question. That is.
There's one that says, how does cultural perception play a role in nutrition choices and decisions?
Okay. I see a lot of questions with 2 upvotes. Is this one of them?
Yes.
How does, wait. Well, I'm just going to go from the top down, number 2. Okay, yes, I see it, Yang Yue. How does cultural perception play a role in nutrition choices and decisions? I think, well, we couldn't look at this very directly in our study, but I'm sure it plays a huge role. I myself, being from 2 different cultures, knows that they think about food very differently. So that's my lay opinion here. I haven't done specific research in this area, but I'm sure it's out there. Next one. How well are national dietary guidelines implemented towards consumers if they're only implemented among professionals? Do we lose the education potential of consumers on how to build health-promoting diet? I guess this question is asking, are consumers receiving enough information about this? Is it effectively disseminated towards them? Is this what it's asking? Because it sounds like consumers not receive it. By the results of the survey, it seems like they're not understanding or applying these these dietary guidelines, and they don't feel that confident in composing balanced meals. But I guess the second part of the question, do we lose the educational potential of consumers on how to, this I'm not clear, but maybe it's asking about whether people should understand what, how diets can address their individual health needs, in which that's a totally different type of education, way of educating people to what has been discussed here. So I recognize that's a different issue. But if you would like to clarify that question, feel free to do so. Number two, another question from Pablo. One of your first slides mentioned that young males are more likely to be less educated on food issues and therefore eat less healthily. Okay, actually it was males tend to eat less healthily, and it might be that they are less knowledgeable on food issues. So the data was about their actual behavior. This contrasts with national overweight data, which indicates that women usually suffer from higher levels of overweight. What do you think explains this? Well, there are differences in physical activities, and there are also biological differences. Like males have a higher proportion of muscles, and muscles burn calories more effectively. So males are more efficient in burning calories in this way. There are probably some explanations, but I'm just a consumer scientist, so I can't speak directly to this issue in terms of the physiology. Bonky Angle. What are the most successful examples of activities campaigns strengthening consumers' awareness of the national dietary guidelines? This is a good question, and this is one that we plan to look into, but I'm not aware of research at the moment that specifically has looked at national dietary guidelines. This survey for us is kind of just the beginning of this research area. We hadn't done that much consumer research before, but now that we know which gaps need to be addressed, we will be more directed in our research in this area. Okay, and from Sarah Rech, is there a behavior change theory which you think applies to helping consumers make better choices? There are lots of behavior change theories. It's kind of like take your pick. But it really depends on which type of choice. It depends on a lot of things, like which type of behavior do you want to increase or decrease? Do you want them to eat more fruits and vegetables? Do you want them to drink less sugar-sweetened beverages? How does the individual themselves, how do they feel about these behaviors, and what stage of are they more or less engaged with this? So these different factors and the food environment that they are a part of is going to affect what theories could be more applicable. So yeah, I can't answer this in a short way. Ebru Akdag, regarding the confusion on the daily consumption recommendation, the categorization is based on carbohydrates, proteins, and vegetables. How does plant protein fit into that picture? Great question. So the question, the wording of the question in our survey did not specify whether the protein was plant or meat-based. You see some dietary guidelines have include like a protein section that is mixed plant, and animal-based protein, or sometimes they separate it out so that pulses are in the vegetable category. So I don't, I can't answer this in a like a. I think in this case, the proteins section, if you are trying, it can be made of protein or plant protein. So it is applicable to both types, to like a vegetarian vegan diet or non-vegetarian vegan diet. So I think it's applicable to both. Yeah. Okay. Emily Noe. I do think the education of influencers who influence about food is even more important than the education of food science journalists. You could be right. I don't know. But it seems like their influence is definitely increasing, and it could be. And at EUFIC, we also work with influencers as well, especially because we run lots of social media campaigns. So we do acknowledge that they also have an important role to play in food education. So now I'm going to look at the other questions. Christina Arroyo Casabuno. With more sustainable and environmental friendly diets, there has been an increase in the consumption of raw milk and meat, even for pets. As a food safety regulator, where does food safety sit with your mission and activities? Well, food safety is one of our areas, but it's not under my area of expertise. Where we see food safety issues and where there might be myths about this, we also try to dispel these myths through our communication channels. So yeah, food safety is an important part. I would say it's kind of a more transversal part of our mission. So we see food safety has a role in even in like food waste or preventing non-communicable diseases. It's not a topic specifically separate from the other our goals in itself. It's a part of everything else. Okay. Could it be, from Roberta Fabrizi, could it be that the recommendations on fresh fruit in Italy relate to making sure people get enough the malleable vitamins like vitamin C? Okay, fresh fruits and vegetables are not necessarily those we can find frozen. I don't know exactly what is the motivation behind this. If it's the case that vitamin C is less available in frozen produce, it could be the case. If people do have particular vitamin C deficiencies in Italy, then that could be a motivation for that. I don't know. Sophie Clark, to what extent are inaccurate or changing national dietary guidelines to blame for the misconceptions the public has about food, and what should be done? So it's not just national dietary guidelines that are inaccurate or changing. It's all of the information people know, whether it's from the media or from influencers or different ways of reporting science. I mean, there has even been studies showing that a lot of the accuracies from food science reporting comes from university press releases. So even starting there in educating university press officers to have more accurate scientific reporting would contribute. So I wouldn't say national dietary, I wouldn't single them out specifically, but they are a good starting point because they have the potential to have a lot of influence. I do. Okay, sorry, the order of questions keeps changing. Suspicion on food additives from Karen Finney. Do we have any info on the basis of this? There is a lot of research. I mean, one researcher I can think of off the top of my head is Michael Sigrist, and he talks about how people are neophobic, how they distrust new technology or new types of ingredients and why they might do so. So might this relate to the worry that consumers are likely to have eaten additives in combinations which may not have been tested long term? well, I'm not going to say it's not related, but there is evidence that people tend to just think that natural things are better, and it's not related to this, particular scientific details of why this is the case. So the fact that additives might not have been tested in the long term would not be the only factor to explain why people are suspicious of food additives. Is it possible for us to take the survey and have the answers? Okay. So the survey, there is a reference for the survey in the slides, so you can find this survey. Actually, the survey we created is an amalgamation of different types of questions, and many of those questions are we have references for because they're taken from other surveys. However, some of these surveys were not updated, so you might answer something correct, what would be considered to be incorrect when it was produced in 2011, but since the research has been updated since then, your answer might be considered correct now, or vice versa. So we can send you the survey, the one we created, but if you take just the answers that with the survey from the references from the time they were created, they might not be 100% accurate. But we checked their answers to see whether they were updated with the latest nutrition information. So this is just a caveat to let you know that if you're using a nutrition survey from the past, it's the answers that they say what are correct or not may have changed since it was developed. And this is something you should always check. Okay. Linda Ockern. A question about food science literacy. Do you have any examples of a more concrete solution, and what would this education entail? Good practice examples to what improves food science literacy. Well, I haven't done a lot of research in this area, so actually we are trying to develop a research program to test what types of educational interventions could improve food science literacy. So I wouldn't there was one study that came out last year about trying to inoculate people, presenting them with with information about how the media presents information in a non-accurate way, and giving them and letting them know how this is not accurate. But that is just one off study, so I don't know in general what the best practices are. Okay, but I could provide a link to that study when we send you the questions, the answers to the questions afterwards. Okay. Sultanat Yegamova, I'm curious about mandatory nutrition experts' scientific literacy. Is it true in Europe no regulations related to food facts for education, nutrition education? This I don't know. I don't know what the qualifications are needed to be a nutritionist, but maybe someone can answer this in the chat. Andy Johnson, has research been done on the price of the healthier diet? Quarter protein, half fruit and veg, quarter carbs, versus the one that people thought was healthy. So they thought that half protein was healthy, a quarter fruit and veg, and quarter carbs. Would having the meat portion save more than doubling the fruit and vegetable portion? So would that be the marketing angle? The healthy diet is cheaper, if true. I would like to think that, but the truth is a lot of people just like meat too much, and they will pay more for it. I mean, you see, they're paying more for meat in the supermarket, even though it's more expensive than fruits and vegetables. So I would say people's behavior would speak against this. On the EU Health Policy Forum, there is a network on healthy food diet, even food that supports the healing of patients. Okay. I'm not sure what this question is from, but it's something I will look into, the EU Health Policy Forum. Okay. And Sven Arts asks, do people from the Asian communities in Europe eat more healthily? Can our Asian communities in Europe be used to introduce more healthy food eating habits? For example, algae, seafood, insects. So some cuisines, they're not necessarily Asian, they could be Middle Eastern or Southeast Asian, or some cuisines are more plant forward than the traditional European diet. And it could be that making these other diets more mainstream could help people to adapt to different types of cuisines that are more plant forward and different ways of eating. I think that might be an easier ask than getting them to eat insects. Okay. I think I've answered pretty much all the questions that I could. So I think that's it, right? Thank you everyone for attending, and I'm glad. Thank you for your time.